St. Thomas Aquinas on just war. The year is 1265. Europe is a fractured landscape of competing powers, shifting borders, and near-constant bloodshed. Local barons raise private armies to settle petty grievances. Mercenary bands roam the countryside, selling their swords to the highest bidder. Monarchs launch devastating campaigns for territorial expansion or wounded pride. Violence is the grim rhythm of medieval life, and for the common person, the arrival of armed men on the horizon means only one thing: fire, famine, and ruin. Into this chaotic world steps a Dominican friar named Thomas Aquinas. He sits at his desk in Italy, laboring over a monumental work of theology that will come to be known as the Summa Theologiae. When he turns his formidable intellect to the question of war, he does not write a military manual. He does not glorify the battlefield or celebrate the conquest of enemies. Instead, he asks a profound and radical question. Under what conditions can a Christian, commanded by Christ to love their enemies, ever pick up a sword? His answer, formulated in the second part of his Summa, question 40, provides the classical Catholic framework for understanding armed conflict. Aquinas treats war not as a glorious enterprise, but as a tragic, agonizing reality that can only be justified under strict, uncompromising moral conditions. He identifies three essential requirements for a just war: legitimate authority, just cause, and right intention. From these three pillars, a broader and more rigorous tradition has developed, giving us 5 clear conditions that make war morally unacceptable. When we examine these 5 conditions rooted in Aquinas' teaching and the broader tradition of the Church, we see a vision of conflict that strips away the romance of battle and places an immense moral burden on anyone who would choose the path of violence. To understand the sheer weight of Aquinas' framework, we have to look closely at the very first condition he lays out. War is fundamentally unjust, he argues, when it is declared without legitimate authority. In the Summa, he writes that the first requirement is the authority of the sovereign by whose command the war is to be waged. This might seem like a mere procedural technicality to modern ears, but in the 13th century it was a revolutionary boundary against chaos. In a world where aggrieved nobles routinely launched private wars against their rivals, devastating the peasant populations caught in the middle, Aquinas drew a hard line. War cannot be initiated by private individuals or rogue groups. Only those responsible for the common good of the entire political community may declare war. If a private citizen is wronged, Aquinas notes, they have recourse to a higher authority, such as a court of law. They can seek justice through the established legal system. But a sovereign prince who has no earthly superior to appeal to is the only one who can rightly take up the sword to defend the commonwealth. Why does this distinction matter so deeply? Because private war inevitably leads to unchecked chaos and endless cycles of vengeance. It replaces the objective pursuit of justice with personal retaliation. It shatters the very fabric of society and violates the order established by God. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans 13:1, "Let every soul be subject to higher powers," an injunction that underscores the divine delegation of authority to those tasked with maintaining public order. When rebels, terrorists, or private citizens take it upon themselves to initiate armed conflict, their war is fundamentally unjust from the very first moment. It lacks the rightful authority necessary to transform the act of killing from murder into a tragic necessity for the defense of the common good. Without that authority, violence is simply chaos masquerading as justice. Even if a legitimate sovereign is the one declaring war, that alone is not enough to make the conflict morally acceptable. The second condition demands that a war is unjust if it is fought without a just cause. Aquinas is unequivocal on this point. He writes that those who are attacked should be attacked because they deserve it, on account of some fault. The language is stark. War must always be a response to a tangible, grave injustice. It must be defensive or corrective in nature. It can never be aggressive. This principle immediately invalidates vast swaths of human history's military campaigns. Territorial expansion is an unjust cause. Economic gain is an unjust cause. Seeking revenge or attempting to assert national pride are unjust causes. If a ruler looks across a border and sees fertile land, rich resources, or a weaker neighbor ripe for conquest, any war launched to seize those assets is morally illegitimate. War must respond to a real objective wrong. It is permitted only for the defense against aggression or for the protection of the innocent who are being unjustly harmed. The prophet Micah delivers a dire warning. Woe to them that devise iniquity, a condemnation of those who plot violence for their own gain. A war fought for power, wealth, or domination is completely morally unacceptable. It corrupts the very purpose of the state, which is to safeguard justice and peace, turning the machinery of government into an instrument of theft and murder. Aquinas understood that the temptation for sovereigns to use war as a tool of statecraft was immense, which is why the requirement of a just cause is so absolute. There must be a fault, a grave wrong that cannot be righted by any other means, to warrant the horrific destruction that war brings. But Aquinas pushes the moral boundary even further inward. It is not enough to have the right authority. It is not enough to have a justifiable reason to fight. The third condition states that war is unjust when the intention is evil. Aquinas writes that it is necessary that the belligerents should have a rightful intention, meaning they must intend the advancement of good or the avoidance of evil. Here, the internal disposition of the combatants and the leaders becomes a matter of grave moral consequence. Even if a nation is unjustly attacked and the sovereign has the authority to respond, the war becomes sinful if the response is driven by dark, corrupting motives. If the defense of war becomes an excuse to inflict cruelty, to harbor hatred, to seek the total annihilation of the enemy out of spite, or to grab glory and domination, the moral justification evaporates. Aquinas leans heavily on his intellectual predecessor, St. Augustine of Hippo, who lived 8 centuries earlier during the slow collapse of the Roman Empire. Augustine had observed the brutal realities of armed conflict and recognized the spiritual poison it could inject into the human soul. In his work Contra Faustum, Augustine provided a chilling catalog of the corruptions of the heart in wartime. He wrote that the passion for inflicting harm, the cruel thirst for vengeance, an implacable and relentless spirit, the fever of revolt, the lust of power, and such like things, all these are rightly condemned in war. This means that a war fought with hatred or cruelty is sinful, even if it is externally justified by a legitimate cause. The Christian tradition insists that the enemy, even the aggressor, remains a human being made in the image of God. To fight them with a heart full of malice, to delight in their destruction, is to lose one's own soul in the process of defending one's borders. The intention must remain fixed purely on restoring justice and peace, a staggeringly difficult moral standard to maintain amidst the blood and terror of the battlefield. This focus on the moral boundaries of warfare leads directly into the fourth condition. A war is unjust when it violates moral law in its conduct, specifically through disproportionate violence or the harming of the innocent. While the technical terminology of what modern theorists call jus in bello, or justice in the conduct of war, was more fully developed by later thinkers like Francisco de Vitoria and Francisco Suarez, the foundational principles are deeply embedded in Aquinas' worldview. His overarching framework implies that war must always be governed by justice and charity. It is not a realm where morality is suspended. The commandment in Exodus 21:3 is clear: "Thou shalt not kill." The traditional teaching understands this not as a total prohibition against all killing, but as an absolute prohibition against unjust killing, most especially the intentional killing of the innocent. In the context of war, this demands the principle of proportionality. The harm caused by the military action must not exceed the good sought. If a nation suffers a minor border skirmish, it cannot respond by leveling the enemy's entire capital city to the ground. That would be a disproportionate and unjust response. Furthermore, the protection of the innocent is paramount. Targeting civilians, engaging in indiscriminate destruction, or committing acts that we would today classify as war crimes fundamentally violate the natural law. Even in a declared war with a just cause and right intention, not everything is permitted. A military force cannot use immoral means to achieve a just end. If a war descends into the slaughter of non-combatants, the deliberate starvation of populations, or excessive punitive destruction, it crosses the line from a tragic necessity into a grievous moral evil. The end never justifies the means, and the brutality of the conflict cannot be used as an excuse to abandon the fundamental demands of human dignity and moral law. The fifth and final condition reveals the ultimate horizon of Aquinas' thought on conflict. War is unjust when peaceful means are ignored. War is never to be treated as a first option, nor even an equal alternative to diplomacy. It is always strictly the absolute last resort. Aquinas holds that the only legitimate purpose of war is peace. Drawing again on Augustine, the tradition affirms that we do not seek peace in order to be at war, but we go to war that we may have peace. If a dispute can be resolved through diplomacy, through negotiation, through international arbitration, or through any other peaceful pursuit of justice, then resorting to war is entirely unjustified. To unleash the catastrophic violence of war when a peaceful solution is still possible is contrary to both human reason and the gospel. Christ's teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God," stands as a constant, challenging beacon over the entire discussion of war. It demands that leaders exhaust every conceivable diplomatic avenue before giving the order to draw the sword. If leaders rush into conflict driven by impatience, pride, or a desire for a swift, violent resolution, they bear the profound moral guilt of all the suffering that follows. War represents the catastrophic failure of human relations, a tragic breakdown of the rational and moral order. Therefore, it can only be engaged when all other paths have definitively failed, when the aggressor simply will not listen to reason, and when the injustice being perpetrated is so severe that to do nothing would be a greater evil than the war itself. When we pull back and look at these 5 conditions together, a profound and sobering picture emerges. St. Thomas Aquinas does not offer a theological loophole for militarism. He does not provide a comfortable justification for the ambitions of kings and generals. He strictly, rigorously limits the use of armed force. From his teaching and the tradition that followed, the message is undeniable. War is morally unacceptable when it lacks legitimate authority, when it lacks a just cause, when it is driven by evil intention, when it violates moral law in its conduct, and when it is not an absolute last resort aimed at securing peace. These are not merely historical guidelines, they are permanent moral demands placed upon the conscience of humanity. They strip away the ideological camouflage that so often covers the brutal reality of armed conflict. Ultimately, all of this reflects a much deeper truth about the Christian understanding of the world. War is only tolerated to restore a shattered justice and to forge a lasting peace. It is never to be pursued for its own sake. The violence is a symptom of a fallen world, a tragic necessity that should always be accompanied by grief, never by celebration. As the psalmist reminds us, in the Douay Rhymes translation of Psalm 45, "He maketh wars to cease unto the end of the earth." The ultimate trajectory of divine providence is toward reconciliation, not destruction. And so, even in those agonizing moments when war is permitted under these strict criteria, the heart must always long for an end to the violence. The conscience must remain alert against the corrupting influence of hatred and the lust for power. The Christian vision insists that even in the darkest hours of conflict, we must never lose sight of peace, justice, and the eventual necessary triumph of charity. If you found this exploration of Aquinas and the moral limits of war thought-provoking, please share this episode with a friend who appreciates deep dives into history and philosophy.